Today on episode 22 of the Play Guitar Podcast, I continue my blues guitar mini-series talking about tone, what gear to get for great blues tone, and tips to use it effectively. Also, we got some listener feedback, so stay tuned. Welcome to episode 22 of the Play Guitar Podcast. I'm Lee, and this is the podcast that's determined to make you a better guitar player. No matter if you're just starting out or you've been playing for years, this is the show that'll help you become the guitarist that you always wanted to be. On today's episode, I'm going to go through the classic gear that has built the classic tones in the blues. And I'll do this in a way that you can put these things into categories with the names of the famous players who use this gear, and we can try to get their signature sounds. But why would we want to do this? Is it so that you'll run out and buy a bunch of expensive gear? No, definitely not. But once you know the sound of and the application of a certain amp or a certain pedal or guitar, you can make more informed decisions with what gear that you want to use. For example, if you know you love the way a super reverb sounds and that's the tone that you're after, you could find amps similar to that to get you in the ballpark. Or if you have to have that super reverb, if nothing else would do, you could start saving without wasting your money on other amps that wouldn't give you the tone that you were looking for. It's no fun when you have to guess about an amp or a pedal only to purchase it, get it home, and be underwhelmed by the tone it offers. So this knowledge, along with tips on the settings of the amps, guitar choices, your pedal choices, it's all very important to achieve that signature tone that you're looking for. So today is a bit of a gear day, which is always fun for me. I like to throw in a few of these now and again. It just keeps things fun. And I did a lot of celebrating last week, so I'm continuing the celebration from this past weekend. So thank you for joining me today. And before we get started, I want you to remember to visit freeblueslesson.com and to sign up for my free lesson that's called Get Your Blues Soloing Under Control. It's the 6 steps I found that gives you the right formula and the foundations for playing killer blues solos in no time at all. And when you sign up for this, you'll also get news about my podcast, my videos, and other cool stuff sent directly to your inbox. So go ahead and check that out at freeblueslesson.com. And all right, it's time to get started. So let's go ahead and get started with the main topic for today. Blues electric guitar tone. 2 weeks ago, I made the case for studying the blues, even if it's not your main style of music. And last week, I went over the chords that you'll come across when you're playing the blues. But this week, I'm continuing my blues mini-series about talking about tone, and more specifically, electric guitar blues tone. And this is a tricky one. A lot of players would say it's easy. Just plug in a guitar, crank the amp up to 11, and play. But coming from experience, that does not always work. Yes, that can be a good sound and even sometimes not just a great sound, the perfect sound. But it's really dependent on a lot of different things. You know, your guitar, the type of pickups you use, the gauge and condition of the strings that you're using, the types of tubes you use, how they're biased, the tube wear, the speakers, whether the amp size is appropriate to the room you're playing. There's just a lot of things to consider when you're trying to go for a great cranked amp blues tone. And if you're fortunate enough to be able to try lots of different amps out at high volumes, things will get real right away. In a split second, you'll know whether that sound's going to work for you or not. You hear how much drive the amp's going to give you, whether that drive will clean up with your volume knob as you roll it down, or is that the sound? Is that the one that fits your idea of what a great blues sound is? Also, you'll see right away if that amp fights you. if it is it touch sensitive, or does it require a lot of force just to get the notes to sound? So that being said, if you're one of the lucky ones that just cranks up your amp and gets exactly what you need, congratulations to you. But for the rest of us, the journey to great blues tone begins here. So let's start. What is great blues tone? Really, what is it? Is it something like B.B. King's sweet, clean, but powerful tone? Or is it more like a sharp Muddy Waters or Albert Collins Telecaster tone? Could it be that Strat into a Fender amp tone like Buddy Guy, Eric Clapton, Robert Cray, and Stevie Ray Vaughan, or countless others have? Or does it need to have more gain, like the blues rock sounds of like Joe Bonamassa or Jeff Beck or Derek Trucks? So what is it? Well, it's really all of the above and more. All of these different players went in different directions to get to the place where they have their own sound. There are definitely similarities to a lot of the equipment in the guitars and the amps and pedals that they play, but the way they combine the different pickups and amps and speakers, tubes, guitars, it was all just a means to an end to get that sound that was right for them. The sound that let them express their feelings in just one or two notes, their voice. You hear this a lot. Oh, they're so good. They could just plug into anything and sound good, or they'd sound like themselves. And I'm sure that's true. They all know what their sound is and can probably adjust, plug into any amp with any guitar, and they make it go in the direction of their sound. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that special tone, the one that is just their own. It's something different altogether. It's inspirational. That sound that's so close to their soul and their feelings, and that ideas and melodies are just spontaneously created in split seconds. That sound that just takes you to places in your playing that you've never been before. To me, that's what good blues tone is. A true, genuine voice on your instrument that not just complements the song you're playing, but lifts it up to higher places. It doesn't matter if it's a clean sound, a distorted sound, a thin sound, or a thick sound. It just has to be genuine. It has to match the player. So where does that leave us? How do we find our own unique blues tone? How can we find the gear that helps us get there without having to go through endless and expensive trial and experimentation? Let's narrow down our choices with some research. I don't know what your ultimate blues tone is for you, but I'm willing to bet you know of a few guitarists that you'd like to sound like. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through some classic gear from some of the greats to see what the gear contributes to that kind of a sound. And once we understand what a certain piece of gear can do for our sound, we can start to narrow down the choices to get our best tone and some tips on how to set them. I was very fortunate to be able to play the W.C. Handy Blues Award show in Memphis twice when I was a member of E.G. Kite's band. The first time I played, I used my homemade Vibrolux amp. The history of that amp was that I had found an old Silverface Bandmaster Reverb. It was the head, and it was in a pawn shop, and it was broken. It didn't work. And so I got it for a very good price. And I took the chassis out of it. I rewired it, and I built a new cabinet, a 2x10 cabinet for it. Essentially, I made it into a Vibrolux, and I used that. I traveled with that amp for years, and I still use it to this day. If you've seen any of my videos, it's sitting right there in the background next to my Fuchs amp right there. Well, the first time that I had played this award show, we set up early. And what they did for this one is they kept the backline amps along with all the amps for everyone who brought their own. And we left them all up on stage through the whole show. And that show was a lot of fun. And it was the first time I got to do something like that. So every once in a while, they make it available on YouTube. I still get a kick from watching it. If it's available, I'll bring it up. But I had no idea that there will be so many performers that night. It was a really good cross section of the blues artists that were playing at the time, and I had a lot of fun. But needless to say, my amp got used a few times that night. A lot of the performers, they just brought their guitars. They walked up, plugged into whatever amp that was close by, And it was really interesting to hear the different tones that came out of my little amp. Each of the guitars said it differently, and they used different guitars. I was using a Les Paul at the time, and I loved being able to hear what it sounded like with these other guitars, with the Fender guitars. And I remember walking up to my amp right before we were supposed to play, and I took a look at all the knobs, and they were all over the place, completely different than I usually set them. I'm glad I noticed that somebody else had used that amp, so I knew to go and set everything back to normal before it was our turn to play. It's weird hearing somebody else play through your rig, and it can make you feel pretty uncomfortable. But being able to hear your gear from the audience point of view is extremely valuable. An amplifier sounds completely different out in the audience than it does on stage. If your amp projects very directionally, or if it has like an ice pick high end, you probably won't realize that on stage, because your amp's down around your legs, around your feet. So hearing my amp being played with different guitars and in different ways and sitting out in the audience, it led me to try some new things with it, some new settings, and using some different guitars to get very different and very cool sounds with it. So I was in a situation of, we'll call it forced experimentation, but I got to hear how different guitars and different pedals sound with my amp, and I learned a lot. But what can we do from home? How can we make some decisions about the gear that we already have or the gear that we want to buy without wasting a lot of time and a lot of money? I think the best thing to do first is go through the common guitars, amps, and pedals that blues players tend to use. And where else better is there to start with the guitar itself? So looking down this list of guitars, it looks very familiar. It looks a lot like the list of guitars from episode 17, The Path to Great Guitar Tone. These are classic guitars, and for good reason. Their tone has withstood the test of time. These tones from these guitars seem to resonate with players and with listeners alike. So when you think of a blues guitar, what do you think? I know that I think of a Stratocaster when I think of a guitar for the blues. I started off on the Strat, and I got away from it for a very long time, and I'm now back to playing a Strat as my main guitar. It is great. If you don't have one, I highly suggest that you pick one up, even if it's a cheap one. The Squier Classic Vibe Strat, it's very affordable, and it is a great guitar. It's got the 5-position pickup switch and the iconic vibrato bar. The Strat is just a workhorse that works for many styles of music. But if you're looking for sounds in the ballpark of like Stevie Ray Vaughan and Eric Clapton, it's very hard to beat. The bright single coil pickups give a lot of snap and sizzle to your sound, but they still retain the warmth that goes well with the blues. If you want to get even brighter, move on to the Telecaster. The Telecaster has been a staple for blues musicians ever since Muddy Waters became electrified. It's got 2 single coil pickups, and they go from the extremes of the Fender sound. You get the twang of the bridge pickup to the almost jazzy warmth of the neck pickup. It can cover many territories. To get an example of how a Telecaster sounds in blues, just listen to Albert Collins, the master of the Telecaster. Okay, so next, let's move past the single coils into humbucker territory. The Gibson ES series, the 335, the 345, and the 355. To some, that's the epitome of a blues guitar. These semi-hollow body guitars have the power and extra drive of the humbuckers with the added warmth of those hollow sides there. Even though they're not considered a bright guitar, it doesn't take much tweaking to get a really great clean sound with plenty of high end from your amp. So the added push of the pickups also drives the preamp of an amplifier harder than a single coil does. When you crank it up, it can give a tube amp plenty of smooth lead tone. The big name that comes to mind for me is B.B. King. He had that 355 Lucille, and it gives a fantastic lead tone to a cranked amp. But you can also listen to Chuck Berry, Eric Clapton, and Otis Rush for great ES style goodness. Let's move on to the next, the solid body Gibsons. and they're gonna round out our blues guitars. The Les Paul, especially with P90 pickups, those single coil Gibson pickups, has a fantastic blues tone. Even Muddy Waters played one for a while. Also the SG, which has been adopted, that's more towards a blues rock and a rock sound, but it can sound fantastic playing the blues. Check out Duane Allman and Derek Trucks for that. And last but not least, the Flying V. You don't need to go any farther than Albert King with the Flying V. It's fantastic. All of the solid body Gibsons have a fantastic lead tones. And as long as you don't put too much gain on them, they have a very complex, woody sound to them. Okay, next, let's start going through the classic amps of the blues. There's so many awesome amps that were used for the blues, but I'm just focusing on the most common today. So let's start small. Let's start with like practice amp. the Fender Champ practice amp and the Gibson GA5, they're iconic amps that are known for their great tone. And both of these amps can be heard on countless recordings for that great cranked amp sound in a very small package. It's perfect for recording. If you're wanting that sound, that cranked up sound in a low wattage, these are for you. But don't let them fool you. I've had several Champs and I still own that Tweed Champ clone over there, and they can be very loud when they're cranked. Very loud. So they're not quite as, to get that cranked up sound, it's still pretty loud. So think about those early recordings of Muddy Waters for the GA5 or the Derek and Adomino's tone from Eric Clapton and Duane Allman using a Champ. Both of those give a great, it's like a woolly drive when you crank them up. But that's the GA5. But the Silverface and the Blackface Champ, they have a little bit tighter tone when they break up. Okay, let's move on. Next up are the Tweed Fender amps, the early Fender amps. These are the ones that you see. You'll see the Tweed Deluxe, the Tweed Bassman, and the Tweed Twin a lot with blues bands. These are the Fender sound, but they have mid-range. The Deluxe is the lower powered of those, and the Bassman and the Twin are higher powered for bigger venues. Just because this series of amps was early in Fender's development, it doesn't mean that it doesn't translate to today's blues players. Just think of the current tones of Eric Clapton and Keith Richards. They both use the high-powered Twin. And you can also think about Buddy Guy, because he uses the Tweed Bassman an awful lot. So you get that great clean rhythm tone with solid mids, and when you crank them up, they have a really full lead tone. The last group of amps that seem to be common to the blues are the Blackface and Silverface Fender series. You'll see the whole line from like Deluxe Reverbs to Vibroverbs, Vibrolux, Super Reverbs, Twin Reverbs, all of them. Whatever venue you have to play, there's a Fender that will work great for you. These classic amps are known for their perfectly clean tone with a nice tight breakup at high volumes. Fender designed these amps with a scooped mid-range, and this works great for clean rhythm guitar. But it can sound great for lead too. But commonly, the Ibanez Tube Screamer with its very prominent mid-range is usually paired with one of these Silverface and Blackface amps when you want to go for that extra gain. Well, the pedal adds that mid-range, and it gives it a smoother and very full lead tone to one of those amps. I think almost all blues players have played this style of amp before, but check out Stevie Ray Vaughan. He's a perfect example of that excellent Blackface tone. So from hearing that, I guess you're saying if you pick a Fender amp for the blues, you can't go wrong. Well, yes and no. It just depends on what you're going for. But these Fender amps have been used time and again to get classic blues guitar tone. But that's not all there is. I've seen wonderful Vox and Marshall and Soldano, and I've seen Matchless and Dr. Z's, and even I've heard great, the newer Fenders, the Hot Rod amps, they give fantastic blues tone. It's all in how you use them and if they're the right fit for your playing. Okay, so before we move on, let's talk about settings on the amp a little bit. Well, you'll see two ways that amps are generally used. The first is getting less frequent all the time. It's old school. It's by cranking the amp up for your lead tone and then rolling the volume control in your guitar down just to get your clean rhythm tone. To get it to just the right amount of breakup, usually that's up between, like, for me, it's like 7 and 10 on the volume. It gets very loud depending on the amp you're using. And smaller venues these days are getting less tolerant of extremely loud levels. So it's becoming harder and harder to run your amp this way. But the second way to use it, which is becoming much more common, is running your amp clean at a reasonable volume and then pushing it with overdrive pedals for that simulated cranked amp sound. And no, you're right, it doesn't sound exactly like a cranked amp, but you get much more control over your sound, and it could be just the tone that you're looking for. Okay, so settings. What settings do you use for the blues? Well, the two knobs that I find I have to adjust the most for a blues show are the volume and the bass knob. The other knobs, the treble, the mid knob, the reverb, and even sometimes a presence knob, they're pretty easy. I generally just set them once by ear, just to where they sound the best for me at the time. And usually I'm done with them for the night. They stay right where they are. But the bass and the volume are a bit trickier. They definitely have some sort of a relationship with each other. The louder that you turn up the volume, the woofier the bass gets. And the woofier the bass gets, the more muddy your tone gets. And the muddier your tone gets, the more you get lost in the mix. And that is no fun at all. You bring all this stuff to the gig, you want to be heard, right? Usually it takes me a while, several songs until I get the volume and the bass just right. It's a bit of back and forth between the two, and it's hard to set unless you're hearing the band at a full volume. At home, though, if you practice at a low volume, you may have to turn the bass up a good bit to like 5 or even more. But once you get good volume on these type of amps, I've seen players that turn the bass all the way off, down to 0, and they still get a very good tone. I usually raise the bass to around 2 for the volumes that I play. The last link in the chain for good blues tone is pedals, specifically overdrive pedals. As mentioned before, the Ibanez Tube Screamer has been the standard for blues overdrive pedals, but it isn't always the best option across the board. If your amp has a lot of mids to it, the Tube Screamer may be too much for your situation. You may want to go more for something like the Boss Blues Driver or the Full Tone Full Drive 2 that has a switch for the flat mids. And so those pedals won't add extra mids that might mess the tone up. So lately, there's also been a lot of pedals like the Full Tone OCD and the Exotic BB preamp that give more of like an amp-like tone than your regular Tube Screamer type pedals. And these can definitely sound good with the gain knob up a little bit more if you need more gain. But what if your amp is almost perfect and you don't want to change the tone? You just want more. You want more sustain and more drive. Well, give a boost pedal a try. A boost pedal is designed to do one thing: make your guitar signal louder. These are great if you like to go between like a Strat and a Les Paul a lot, back and forth. The boost pedal can raise the output of the Strat to the same as your Les Paul. So you don't have to drastically change your amp settings every time you switch between the two. You just turn it on for the Strat, turn it off for the Les Paul. I like the Exotic EP Booster. It's just got one knob to dial in how much extra you want. It's easy. It sounds great in front of an amp, and I also use it in front of other overdrive pedals. Okay, so with all of this in mind, where do you go from here? First off, really think about what your ultimate blues tone would be. Is it thick and distorted, or is it a scooped rhythm sound? And then maybe use an overdrive pedal for lead. Do you like the sound of pedals, or do you just want a cranked amp? Is there a guitarist that you'd like to get closer to their tone, or is it a mixture of several different players' tone that you're after? So take the examples I went over today as a reference to get basically in the ballpark of the tone that you're looking for. Research the gear that the players you like and use and start to map out your own tone. A lot of the stuff is very expensive. So when you're ready, search out all of the similar alternatives and their price ranges for something that suits your needs a little bit. So there it is. There's my overview of the common gear, its uses, and some tips to get the most out of them. And that was super fun. I love talking about gear. It always makes me want to run out and buy something new or order something. But I hope it helps being able to put these things in categories for you to get a certain sound. Once I learned and used a bunch of this gear, I started to realize what amps and pedals would give me what sound, and I was able to make better decisions about my purchases. I had a lot of fun bringing that to you today, but I have a question for you. My question is, what is your favorite blues tone, and what combination of guitars, amps, and pedals can get you that sound? Let us know in the show notes at www.playguitarpodcast.com/022. This is listener feedback. This is where if you have a comment or a question that I can help you with, I'll try my best to help you. To get in touch, you can always email me at feedback@playguitarpodcast.com. You can also use the comments on the show notes page, or use the contact form, or leave me a SpeakPipe voicemail on my contact page. Well, I knew this week would probably be one of those light feedback weeks. It's the end of school and Memorial Day weekend here in the States, and the changing of seasons is starting to happen elsewhere, and that's pretty much how it went this week. Not a whole lot. But I did want to share one very cool thing that happened this week. Just for fun, I was looking at some of the guitars we have here at the house. And we have one that was my father-in-law's old guitars, and this guitar has left me, all of us, puzzled for a long time. We had no idea what it was. It's a Les Paul copy. It's got that shaped body, but had no logo and had no serial number on it. But it does have one big difference. Almost all of half of the face of the guitar is covered with a control plate. It's got switches for fuzz, face, echo, tremolo, wah, and whirlwind effects. And it's got all sorts of other cool switching and controls. It's very 70s looking, and it's very funky. So for a laugh, I thought I'd put a pickup on Twitter and Instagram. I put them on there, and I was going to put the caption, "Take that, line 6." But I ended up not saying that. But I just said something like, "Have you ever seen one of these before?" Well, not long after that, I got a message from Chris from the UK, who's a longtime listener here, and he had ideas about what it could be. And I told him, I said, "You'd know better than me. I've given up a long time ago trying to figure that out." So, well, within a few hours went by and he did it. He solved the mystery. I don't know what kind of Google wizardry he did, but he found out that it was a K Univox effector. I think it was sold out of the Sears catalogs. It was not a very expensive guitar, but it is really cool looking. And I tried to put a new battery in it, and it kind of crumbled when I opened the battery case. So I've got some work to do on it, but I'm going to get it fixed up. Maybe I'll play it here on the show. We can get some of those effects working there. Anyway, I just wanted to share that with you, and it's so cool to finally find out something about this guitar. And thanks to Chris from all of us here. Okay, that's a wrap. Thank you for joining me today for the Play Guitar Podcast. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the show on iTunes or your podcast player. Also, I'd really appreciate if you could leave an iTunes review for the show. If you're interested in online lessons, go on over to playguitaracademy.com to join my early adopter list to get news on the opening of the site and an early adopter discount. Also, follow me on all of my different social media pages. Links to them are at www.playguitarpodcast.com. Thanks again, and I will see you on the next episode.